Ember Falls, working title. By Sean Imrie, first resettling. 1. Abby. October 27th had been a day like any other. There wasn't anything particularly special about it. No anniversary or birthdays fell on it, no public holiday either, yet for Abigail Hansen it was a very great day indeed. Great in size, not in tone or vibe. She was only ever Abigail when there was something amiss, when she had royally screwed up and had found herself up a certain creek without a certain piece of apparatus. Any other time she went by Abby, just Abby. On that particular October 27th, though, she was most certainly Abigail. Staring at a figure straight ahead of her, Abby had shook her head in disbelief at how they had the audacity to just stand there, looking like shit when they had no right to. Unshowered, matted hair, which looked like a nest of tangles that belonged in a bird's nest and not a person's head. Ghoulish, unhealthy-looking and glum, with days-old food stains on their pajamas. Abby wasn't sure what she hated more, that the person had the audacity to just stand there in front of her looking so disheveled, and didn't seem to have a care in the world at their lack of pride in their appearance, or that she was looking in her bedroom mirror. "Get ready, Abigail. Right now. We cannot miss this flight," came a shout from downstairs. It was unmistakably her father. Even though he was abrasive, and they were currently at loggerheads, she knew that there was little choice other than to obey. That didn't mean that she had to like it, though, sticking a middle finger up at him and mouthing for him to go and love himself, neither of which he would see or hear, but it made her feel better to stick it to him. Even if only in her head. That would most certainly tell him all right. The pain in the ass that he was. Normally Abby loved to fly. She loved the whole ritual, from arriving at the airport and grabbing a piping hot coffee, going through security and picking up a mammoth bar of chocolate that she was never going to eat on the flight. All the way to boarding the plane, people watching the whole time, the sweet old married couples getting assistance with their frailty, the families that were trying and failing to control their sugar rush high kids as they worked on 4 hours sleep, the couple so in love it was a little bit sickening, but also massively jealousy-inducing, sharing inside jokes and Eskimo kisses. And taking cute selfies. All that coupley shit. Then there were people like Abby who, she supposed, weren't worth watching, except maybe to pity. It wasn't as though she had a fear of flying, or anything paranoid or anal like that. Abby had watched enough documentaries and horror films to know that shit like that didn't really happen in this day and age, particularly in this part of the world. Or if it did, the odds were astronomically high. The reason for her defeated despair was simply that she really did not want to be on that damn plane. It was almost like a reflex that Abby noticed her hand fidgeting its way through the playlist on her phone that she had made on Spotify, whilst in the cab. Good vibes only. That was complete bullshit, and she knew it. It was going to take a lot more than a playlist of songs with a lame name to cheer her up. Even if they were her go-to tracks. The ones that settled her head, and her heart. Or the part of the head that Abby told herself was the heart anyway. Some things couldn't be solved with a guitar riff or a palpably impressive rap, even for a melomaniac like Abby. Some things were much more complicated, and then there was the predicament that she found herself in. Something dark and malicious had a hold of Abby in that shabby, grimy, grubby chair that she found herself sitting in, and it was an unhealthy level of anger. She was furious, and at the same time Abby was frightened. It was almost as though someone was pressing down on her shoulders without respite, or that she was in a swimming pool without knowing how to swim. Or perhaps both, with someone holding her head under the chlorine-overdosed water and not letting her up for air. The knowledge at the forefront of the mind that at least a dozen other swimmers had urinated in that water. Things were currently so bleak in Abby's mind that even seeing the blanket of clouds out of the airplane window that normally entranced and hypnotized, and took her back to an earlier, more innocent stage of her life, did nothing. Gripping onto the hard plastic armrest tightly with her free hand was all that Abby could do, to channel the heat that she could feel coming from inside. It was as though she was on the verge of exploding, a powder keg of emotions that would burst forth from within her, shooting up to the sky outside the aircraft like fireworks, arcing through the great unknown of an autumnal sky. Emotions being the blaze that dared to light up the velvet dark. Only Abby's fireworks weren't pretty colors and whooshing sounds for the awe of children, hers were chaos and longing. And a vulgar reaction to heartbreak that she was barely keeping at bay. Abby didn't want to feel that way, of course. It would take a very disturbed individual to want to be miserable, but everything and everyone just felt so damn indifferent, even her mother. This was in no way, shape, or form her mom's fault, but in her heart, Abby had literally nothing left to say to her. The last few weeks had been trying enough, and all that she had to find comfort in was knowing that she'd tried her best to be a good person. That didn't stop the fretting over what she was going to say when they landed, though, whether or not to repeat that she didn't want to be here, or to keep things unhealthy yet mature and bottle it up. It was on Abby's mind that there was a third option, to let her feelings bluntly and honestly be known once again, but that hadn't ended so well the last time. Ungrateful and embarrassment were the words used against her. They may have been used in the heat of the moment, but that didn't stop them from losing any of their venom. The words levied against her still stung like a fresh bruise, even though the exchange was 2 days ago. Sometimes Abby really hated being so sensitive about every little comment and remark, every little criticism. Normally, she would at least try to find the positive in any given situation, for outward appearance's sake at the very least. While that hopeless optimism that her mother had instilled in her may have worked when she was a preteen, now it just felt like cliché, grade bullshit. The kind that people of a certain class tell themselves to help sleep at night. You've got it easier than starving kids in Africa, that kind of trash. It was the same kind of stuff that her mom would say years ago. Nowadays, though, there was so much wrong with that statement beyond simply gaslighting your kids with the third world so that they would eat their veggies. Today was not a day for optimism, though. That just seemed like too much effort on a day that she just wanted to curl up in her unmade bed, keep the curtains closed, and stay in those same stained pajamas. Pungent with a certain odor? Abby wanted to bury her head in the sand like some kind of demented flamingo or ostrich. She couldn't remember what the saying was, but right then it was irrelevant. Her fingers drifted over to the phone's photo gallery. The option of looking up a meaningful or uplifting quote on the browser was taken from her, since it was on airplane mode, and would be for a while yet, but recently, Abby had started screenshotting and saving motivational stuff for those lonely days where the blues took over. Days like today. Act as if what you do makes a difference. It does. She scoffed. That didn't seem likely on the day that her whole life was being uprooted, and all of the kicking and screaming had changed nothing. We must let go of the life we planned so as to have the life that is waiting for us. Right then, Abby hated that quote. It didn't matter how relatable it was. She didn't want the life that was waiting for her. With a swipe along the phone screen to view the next quote, Abby's heart sunk that little bit. Or when she found they had been interspliced with a selfie that she and Janie took together at the Paramount Theater 3 weeks ago, the one that they both liked. A rare photo where nobody had their eyes closed or had a double chin, although under those chandeliers, Abby supposed that it would be impossible to look bad in a photo. She gulped down a lump in her throat, looking at her best friend, and how happy she looked in the picture. It made her realize just how much had happened in the last 3 weeks. Before nostalgia could take her, though, Abby knew it was time to close the phone. At least I've got a window seat. Abby scoffed at such a lame attempt to force some optimism onto her sour face that must have been a sight to behold. Any positivity that may have followed faded quicker than the flavor of the complimentary shortbread that the tired-looking hostess, Wendy, handed out. Force of habit continued, it seemed, as Abby clocked her name badge. It turned out that there were still some things that she was incredibly anal about, and no relocation was going to change that. She was nosy. Her current circumstances were evidence enough of that. When a familiar song came piping through her headphones, though, it reminded Abby of home. Not necessarily just home, but of her friends, albeit very few of them, and the haunts that she'd made her own. Memories of Pike Place Market came flooding back. The craft stalls were a personal favorite. There were those really bizarre artwork tables that just merited a kind of pity. She couldn't think of anyone that would buy one to proudly display in their lounge or whatever. They were more likely the type of thing you bought someone as a last-minute Christmas or birthday present. One that said, "I like you just enough to get you this really ugly painting, but it's made local and supporting a small business so you can't judge." Not that the artist would care about those kind of assumptions. A sale is a sale after all. Then there were the 1,000,001 tables that all seemed to be selling the exact same jewelry. Big cardboard signs written with permanent marker, letters filled in with highlighter pens, sterling silver, as if it were a rare and high-end thing. They probably wondered why the folks selling proper jewelry like wood-crafted stuff or pebbles with runes on them were making more sales than they were. Some of the vendors there, they really didn't credit customers with enough perception to tell the difference between something that was handcrafted and something that was just plain, wholesale, cheap shit. The part that Abby loved the most was the homeware section of the market, where people would make plates, bowls, and coffee mugs out of clay or glass or something recycled. She never paid all that much attention to the ins and outs of all that, just thought that the deep blue and gray ones made from sea glass were really cool. All the market stalls in the world, though, didn't compare to the 36th annual Figgy Pudding. Normally it was held at the Westlake Center, but last year it came home to Pike Place Market. Abby couldn't remember all that much about it, as she and Janie had snuck a lot of mulled wine down their throats. So much that she was now sworn off it for obvious reasons. She did remember the thousands of people down there, so many in fact that it was almost like there was no COVID-19 or lockdown. People were allowed to just be people again, and it was so damn refreshing. In Abby's mind, you couldn't get much cooler around Christmas time than a fully amateur caroling competition, even if she didn't have the guts to take part. The song was Need You Now by Lady A. It was one of her all-time favorites, one that found its way onto just about every playlist that Abby had on her phone. It was a song that she, Janie, and her big brother, Paul, would sing all the time. While it made her think of Pike Place Market for some reason, it also made Abby reminisce about Cary Park and a picnic they all had there. Sometime in the summer, when they belted out the song using plastic water bottles as pretend microphones. The park was always super touristy, which could be annoying, but now that she was leaving, that was something Abby knew that she was going to miss. They'd mess with the tourists sometimes. The ones that had an attitude, often sending them off in the wrong direction for stuff, or asking them for directions and watching them panic like a fish out of water. Nothing mean. Abby and Janie weren't like that. Paul had the tendency to be a little more twisted, but it all depended on the person and how they approached us. Or for Paul, how they spoke to his little sister. Cary Park was amazing though. All of the ferries could be seen crossing Elliott Bay. Mount Rainier loomed in the distance, almost looking like Mount Doom, all ominous. Then, of course, there was the Space Needle. Right there stood a picture-perfect view of everything that Seattle had to offer. It was no wonder that tourists and locals both loved this place. It was where Abby had done a lot of her best thinking the last few days. Alone. Making friends wasn't something that Abby did easily. It wasn't as though she was a bad person, or a cold and unfeeling one, just that she was socially lacking. A bit of a nerdy outcast. One that wasn't entirely sure just how she had fallen into a friends group in Seattle, but knew that leaving the small group that had accepted her, maladroit weirdness aside, to go somewhere new and start over, that was hurting her more than the fight that she'd had with her parents. The admission of that fact made Abby even more emotional the more that she thought about leaving her best friend Janie behind in Seattle, and how raw and hurtful their parting had been. There were so many things that Abby would eternally be grateful for, and having a wing woman like Janie Atkins as, not just a friend, but a best friend. That was high up the list. They'd met in school one day when, due to overcrowding, two classes that normally wouldn't have learned together were packed into the same class, like sardines. One of the popular girls, Coppola, had thrown an eraser at the back of the substitute teacher's head. We all called her the Crow because of the deep-set wrinkles all over her face, the dyed black hair that nobody in their 70s has a right to have, and the fact that when she got mad, she squawked, just like a crow. I, of course, got detention when the old bitch turned around while Coppola got off free. Janie must have seen it all as she grabbed her eraser and threw it straight at the Crow, hitting her right between the eyes. Her response? Detention, naturally. Janie's reply? Miss, you look like something that came out of a slow cooker. I laughed. We all laughed. From that first detention, we became inseparable. Until now, that illusion was shattered. We are, and always had been it seems, quite separable. As Abby glanced across the aisle on the plane, and saw complete strangers talking to one another, laughing and joking, and telling each other their life stories. It just reinforced the knowledge that she was an introvert and really proud of the fact. She wasn't just comfortable knowing that. She actually really liked being the way that she was. Nightclubs and dating felt so strange to her, and music festivals were not her scene either. She'd only ever really tried those kind of things when Janie was there to give her a little nudge out of the comfort zone. Abby was more at home with her faithful camera and an empty SD card, or her sketchbook and pencils, with a massive library of playlists on her phone. Those were the things made her happy. The things that gave her that special high, the kind of happiness that came with an accompanying grin, like you were advertising a new toothpaste. None of that stuff was ever going to make her any money or be life-changing, though. Abby had no illusions about that whatsoever. That wasn't self-pity, or being too hard on herself with unjustified criticism. Plain and simple fact that she just wasn't that good. Plus, Abby preferred photography and sketching as hobbies that she got enjoyment from, and worried that they'd feel like a chore or would turn stale if she did focus one of those things as a career. Janie always told her that she should go for it, but Abby was not so sure. Thinking back between one thing and another made it inevitable that Abby should daydream some more and think back on the fight and the harsh words that had poured from her mouth before she could stop and cram them back in. The ones she'd said to her parents for forcing her to move her entire life. Abby had told them that she hated them, and in that moment she really did. She hated them both for not taking her side. Abby had been vilified for being honest, and it was about as far from fair as you could get. Why they were moving in the first place was ridiculous. If I could afford to live in Seattle by myself, then I would, and you'd both be far away from me with your bullshit. She'd said, wanting nothing more than to cause hurt. They reminded her, of course, that she was still only 19 years old, and they wouldn't allow it. That and Abby should watch her language. With no other family there, and the big fallout with Janie, there was no realistic alternative. Despite the barbed words and jagged tongue that had found their way through her happy-go-lucky, fake-smiling exterior, over having to start her life all over again, Abby would have missed her mom and dad way too much. The fight was days ago, but again another reason that Abby was so anal was the fact that she tended to overthink absolutely everything, and then think about it some more for good measure. It hadn't even been an hour after the shouting match, the one where they had called her an entitled and ungrateful little bitch, or something to that effect, and Abby had apologized. It had all got too much. The pain of leaving home, of leaving Janie, of being angry with them when she hadn't even considered how they'd be feeling, her mom especially. Even though Abby had her pride and didn't want them to see her cry, it was just too much. She threw herself at her mother without saying a single word, almost knocking the glass out of her hand. And the tears didn't so much roll down her face as they did stream, like an uncontrollable tide, while Abby said that she was sorry over and over again. Even as her mom's arms nestled her snugly, constricting her with kindness and love, Abby trembled still, and before long even she could hear that her words were coming out as an incoherent garble of noises. And so she stopped trying to talk and just let it all out. Sniffling and snotty noises piercing the shame-filled sobs over the hurtful things she had used as weapons, when part of her knew she didn't mean them at all. Her mom was crying too. Abby could hear it in her voice as she rubbed her back like she used to do when Abby was a little girl, and would get upset about things. She could hear her through the emotions telling her, "It's okay, Abby, it's okay," or, "Oh, my sweet baby, please stop. Please stop crying, Abby." Her dad had already left the room by this point. Expecting the same kind of warmth from him would be foolish at this moment in time. Abby wasn't sure about her mom, as she didn't dare to look up at her, knowing it would probably set her off again, but knew that she herself was downright ugly crying, and probably the fact that she was embarrassed about that made her cry even more. All the excitement of being on a plane to somewhere completely new, the tabula rasa, the blank slate, it should have been exciting, liberating, invigorating, or all of the above. Whereas in reality, all that Abby could think of was the hurt look on her mom's face when she was telling her everything. Abby suddenly became aware that she must have been in more of a state than she thought, as a runaway tear started making its way down her face, trailing down to her cheek before she caught with the sleeve of the new sweater that her dad had bought at Tacoma before they boarded. It was a very touristy, bright blue, I Heart Seattle sweater, with the heart being a big, bright, pinky red love heart. It was pretty obvious that he had bought it to be endearing, or as some kind of practical joke, thinking it would never get worn, but he must have got a surprise when Abby put her chunky sweater into her hand luggage and threw it on top of her vest. The joke was on him there, too, Sarah. You've not changed one little bit. That's what Sarah remembered thinking when it boiled down to it. Neither of them had. Both just saying the first thing that came into their heads, and making spectacles of themselves, saying things that people who love each other never should, saying things that family never should. Throwing words around like monster and disgrace, and expressing thoughts that they surely didn't mean. That she was an embarrassment and an accident, or how she wished he would do everybody else a favor and just die already. Leaving Sarah to get caught in the crossfire between them. Invisible, just like always. Her husband, with his total disregard for them both and their daughter, pouring her heart out to her parents in the kitchen and losing her composure. Sarah thought for sure that she would start smashing glasses or throwing plates, but even though she was hurting, Abby remained Sarah's sweet girl. She may have been 1 year away from 20, but she'd always be a baby in her eyes. Sarah slouched over the table, alone. Pete was out God knows where, and Abby was up in her bedroom. This left her alone to enjoy the quiet, and 2 very full glasses of red wine. There was something about being alone at a time like that, which really gave her time to think, to put everything into perspective and try to process it. Sarah tidied up the dinner dishes in the sink, rather than use the dishwasher, being particularly old school like that. Something that, when said aloud, got a furious eye roll from Abby, even if she was smirking ever so slightly. Both her head and her heart hurt. Sarah remembered that detail so lucidly, even if it was only days ago. Not medically, not any kind of hemorrhage or pain that would prompt her to phone an ambulance, just a feeling of being so lost in the grief of it all. Sarah knew her limits, of course, but she was glad to have those 2 glasses of Merlot, and then the rest of the bottle. It was needed. "Are you sure that you've not had enough?" she heard him ask Pete. The dulcet tones of his boorish voice brought Sarah back from her kitchen to the seat in first class on their plane, and the 2nd or 3rd glass of complimentary Prosecco that she held in her shaky hand. "I think I'll be the judge of that, thank you," she replied, a condescending smile on her lips to go with the sass. It was intended, and she was glad that he saw it. "Thanks for caring though, darling." He said nothing. Sarah would much rather have sat next to Abby, but since Pete bought the tickets, he'd never have sat back there with the common folk, while his ball and chain and ungrateful brat sat up the front enjoying a hot meal and wine, or in Abby's case, some fruit juice. That was the first thing that Sarah's husband had said to her since they boarded, apart from asking if she wanted him to store her carry-on in the overhead compartment for her. She said no. If she wanted to store her bag, then she was more than capable of doing it herself. She didn't say that, though. Things were strained, but they were also calm, some peace at last before things blew up again, and Sarah knew that they would. The way that things were left with him and Abby, it would only be a matter of time before things collapsed and blew up again. If she was lucky, it wouldn't happen in a public place. Sarah thought that she might just die of embarrassment if that happened. She checked her small wristwatch, hoping that it wouldn't be too much longer until the plane landed. Though it would be a long time before they got settled into their new life. 3. Abby. Abby winced at the crick in her neck. The chairs on these kind of flights were downright instruments of torture. To hell with waterboarding, or that hole under the fingernail thing. It occurred to Abby that if anybody needed someone to talk, all they would need to do was put them in one of these chairs for a good few hours. Another random thought that popped into her head, while she was thinking about flying, was just how people do this every day, or every other day, frequent flyers, the ones that commute by air. They had to have built up calluses on their asses, either that or be in need of a good massage at the end of the week. Every week. She used the hand rest nearest the window to lift herself out of the chair for a moment. Not only to try and get some feeling back in her butt, which was well past the going to sleep stage, and was just plain numb, but also to look and see if she could spot her mom and dad. Abby knew that she was back here, and they were all the way up there, but she did wonder if one of them might have made an appearance, to come and see how she was doing. She didn't blame them for not doing that, though. The plane was absolutely packed. Despite everything, it was nice to see, if a little worrisome. She figured that it would be hypocritical of her to applaud a large crowd at the figgy pudding, but be concerned about a busy plane. Something just felt different here, though, surrounded by strangers who were coughing and sniffling and blowing their noses. Even though social distancing, rules and regulations, and all of that stuff was a thing of the past, illness was still something that Abby thought about. Especially after how sick her mom got a year ago. That had been a really scary time. Abby couldn't recall ever seeing her mom so frail. She'd been unable to leave her bed when she'd caught COVID. There was undoubtedly 1,000,001 COVID stories, and everybody had heard the symptoms or knew somebody that was sick, but it seemed to hit different when it was someone that Abby knew she couldn't cope without. She'd held her mom's hair back when she had to be sick, made her hot water bottles when she felt cold, made her damp cloths when the fever spiked, the whole time. Seeing just how brittle her mother had become, like the stained glass windows on a gingerbread house, ready to crack and shatter at the slightest bit of pressure. Completely and utterly helpless. That wasn't a word that was associated with Sarah Hansen, but that's just what she was, helpless and weak. Now she was just a different kind of weak. The fact that everybody was all packed in together had Abby sweating like a hog under her layers. It wasn't something that she was proud to admit, but there were no other words for it. She was sweaty and she smelled. Abby wiped her forehead with the sleeve of her new sweater since she felt really awkward about taking it off. She would much rather sweat and not bother anyone than accidentally nudge and irritate someone, fretting that they'd snap at her, the tramp at the window seat with the audacity to brush against them. Lost in her music once again, Abby wasn't sure how long passed before she felt a sudden and sharp jab into her side, which gave her quite the start. She turned her head immediately and found it was the prodding of old woman that was sat next to her, and more specifically, her bony finger. Her face looked a combination of offense and impatience, like she'd finally found the person who'd been shitting in her cornflakes the whole flight. Instantly, Abby went into panic mode. It was part of the overthinking. She went through the list of worries rapidly in her head. Maybe she'd nudged her? Or perhaps the music was too loud. Or maybe when she wiped her forehead, some sweat had dripped onto her. Or maybe she was taking up too much room, although Abby had purposefully pointed her knees toward the window so that she didn't accidentally do that. Abby saw that she'd already started talking, so quickly snatched the headphones from her head to hear what the old woman had been saying. "Sorry?" she blurted out, not putting her most confident self across by starting the conversation with a word that could be construed as an apology. Though that's not how Abby had meant it, it was meant in the same vein as someone might say "excuse me" in a crowd, but really mean "get out of the damn way." "I had my headphones on and didn't hear you," she explained passively. "I said—" She shook her head with a kind of dramatic sigh, "face mask." Right then, Abby was puzzled. She was sure that you didn't have to wear them on planes anymore. In fact, you hadn't had to for the longest length of time, but the way the old woman was glaring at her had Abby questioning herself. "Oh, I'm sorry," she said once again, feeling her face reddening slightly over apologizing again, when she knew, or was fairly certain anyway, that she was in the right. Abby began to wonder if maybe her age was a factor in this whole conversation, or perhaps some sort of dementia. "I don't think it's mandatory to wear them anymore," she said, trying to find her most polite and respectful tone. Even though she was a little miffed at the old woman just randomly poking her in the side, still in disbelief that there were people operating like that in this day and age. "I don't care." She spoke up and interrupted Abby, giving no chance for her to explain any further. It quickly became apparent that the old woman wasn't looking for a discussion or a debate, and it seemed like she just wanted to find someone to rant at for the remainder of the flight. Abby began to wonder whether she should bother trying to make her understand that those days were over, or if she should just leave her to go on and on. The funny thing was that she looked really sweet. Your traditional Hallmark daytime TV grandma. The kind that was always baking a fresh batch of cookies just as you happened to pass by, and would marvel at the geraniums and sunflowers or listen to birds chirping on a park bench. Talking to anyone that would listen, in reality though she was sharp-tongued, foul, and opinionated. Abby thought better of debating the point with her, knowing that it would result in an argument which would cause a scene, and confrontation was not something that she handled well. Abby would always start strong, but end up in tears when she get too angry, or frustrated, and anxiety set in, meaning that she didn't say the things that she wanted to say. "You don't have to be so rude about it. I was wearing a mask every day when—" Again, she interrupted rudely. "Bullshit." The old woman snapped with a fierce look in her eyes that made Abby want to back away from her. Cowering into the corner against the window was all that she could do, desperately wanting to escape the situation. Before realizing how pathetic she was acting, the woman looked as if she weighed 40 pounds soaking wet, and like a strong breeze would knock her over. There was no reason to fear her forked tongue or ignorant, and probably unstable mind. Though she was attracting a few head turns from the seats in front, and Abby just wanted her to shut her mouth. "I know exactly what people your age are like. You're all the same." She didn't reply to her, of course. Abby was wanting to avoid the scene if she could. So, grabbing the backpack from beneath her feet and unzipping the front section of it, she retrieved the face mask that her mom sewn for her from an old cloth. Caving in and wearing it was all she could do to placate the situation. When Abby put it on, it was strange. For months on end, everyone had worn face masks everywhere they went. And now it felt so strange and restricting to be wearing one. The ironic thing was that in order to berate her on the importance of wearing face masks, and how everyone was fucking awful apart from her, she had to lower her mask. Abby wanted to tell her that. She wanted to tell her that she was batshit crazy, and a bully and a fucking hypocrite. But she didn't. Just looked down at her feet instead, hoping that the lunatic would stop talking now that she was wearing a face mask, hoping that stop pestering her. The more that she kept going on and on about the youth of today, and how they didn't care about the virus, how they were more interested in going out and getting drunk than saving other people's lives by just staying in. It was as if the old witch thought she was back in 2019, when the world stopped for COVID. Abby grew tired of it. There was no way that she was going to rise, or maybe sink, to her level. She wouldn't turn this into a shouting match. The proper saying eluded her: "You can't argue with crazy." Or was it stupid? Either way, it still applied to this old bitch, and she was not in the right headspace to have this argument. Instead, Abby used her only escape and slipped her headphones back on. Back to her good vibes only playlist that right now, Abby was praying would live up to its name. The song that had been playing and flooded into her ears was Obstacles by Hannah Tell. She liked her cover more than the original. It was sweeter on the ears. Out of the corner of her eye, Abby could see the old witch talking to other passengers across in the aisle. Another mask nut. She could see her gesturing with the tilt of a head, and through the music, Abby was pretty sure that she heard her say, "This one here." The person across the way was either just as delusional as her, or simply too afraid to argue with her, as I saw them shaking their head right along with her. It wasn't right. The old hypocrite, what she was doing was completely wrong. That mean old bitch was passing judgment after judgment. She'd made all sort of assumptions on Abby's character when in reality they were complete strangers. The anger was coming back. She could feel it. Abby had to grip onto the armrest and turn away from the woman, closing her eyes as tightly as she could. The way with eyes closed shut so tightly that Abby could feel that she was scrunching her face up. She just focused on the lyrics coming through her headphones and tried to lose herself completely in the music. With her senses obscured, Abby slipped her phone back into her pocket and took a tight grip of her left wrist with her right hand, as tight as she could bear, and tried to slow her rapid breathing. It was something of a coping mechanism that Abby had used the last few years. Whenever things got too much, it helped. With the music and her tight grip helping to soothe things, Abby found that for the first time on that flight, she could be alone with her thoughts. Her genuine thoughts, and not ones of despair over the flight, or anger over her family, or even fear from the old bully that she was sat beside. The first thing that came into her mind was the old woman. Abby wondered if she had any children or grandchildren to be so learned. I bet she gives them a lump of coal for Christmas, or boring and itchy socks. She couldn't help but smirk at her own aspersions that she was making about her now. Maybe she thinks so highly of herself that she believes she is the gift. The one that keeps on giving, year after year. Next came thoughts about mom and dad, and how they were doing. Abby was curious as to whether or not they had to put up with this kind of shit while they got their free wine and meal. At least they had each other for some kind of support, even if things were rocky to say the least. There was no way that dad would sit there and listen to someone talk to mom like that. If he'd been sat back here next to her, on the other hand, Abby was pretty sure that he wouldn't have stood for it either. But in her insecure head, she pictured him sitting there and letting the old woman berate her as she had done. To teach a lesson or something. Thinking about mom and dad must have been stressful, as when Abby looked down to her wrist, she noticed that her grip was nearly cutting off the blood supply. Abby closed her eyes again. This time, though, just closing them calmly, rather than shutting them tightly as if to block out the whole world. With my head resting beside the window, she let out a long and peaceful exhale into her face mask as she thought of home. Her real home, Seattle. Before they left for the airport, she had written a poem. Abby only ever wrote poetry in two moods: extremely elated and so full of joy that she could burst, or super depressed. Either end of that scale, and she knew there was a need to get her thoughts down on paper before she spontaneously combusted. Before she had said goodbye to her bedroom, Abby had taken her poem and attached it with a safety pin to a lone worn-out clothes hanger that she left in the small wardrobe, and could recite it word for word, as it came from her heart. It wasn't just about home. A lot of ancient history found its way into her writing too, but she thought it would be a kind of neat thing to do. Something for the next person to find when they moved into the property. Deep down, Abby was quite proud of her writing. It wasn't something that she did very often, but when she did, it was a labor of love. It wasn't meant for social media, or for submitting, but for the eyes of one person in particular. In this instance, it had been written for the home that she grew up in. Silently, under her face mask, Abby recited every word of it, as if that piece of paper was right in front of her. It is the late afternoon. The sun is setting over the city of Seattle and shadows fall underneath buildings, one after the other, lying on their backs mimicking jealousy to the tall giants. She will be in her kitchen stirring lemongrass tea, humming a song she'd heard earlier that day. Perhaps on the radio, perhaps on the television, perhaps on the train. She'd glide onto her balcony overlooking endless roofs of houses, buildings, and cars. She will never jump. She will never lean. She will simply sit and read books. Mystery books, love books, books about everything, books about nothing. She read it all, and he loved that, but he hated it too. Wondered how someone could detach themselves from the real world. To live in one made of only words. Yet he questioned her motives. She continued. It has been a year, 4 months and 3 days since her eyes last met his. Time has moved slow, crunched along, eased forward, never taking steps back. The tape hardly ever rewinds, and if it does, only for a brief moment. She will be on the train, and suddenly he steps inside. He looks just like him from behind. The jacket, the hair, the shoes, and then he turns, revealing nothing but a stranger on a train. She will be sitting in a cafe, and suddenly the sweet and distinct smell of him. How it rains over her, and she will look around frantically. Perhaps he is here, but then reality reminds her that he is back home. Swimming in the little city. Accustomed to every street name and curve in the road. She is in Seattle. She is a runaway, a dancer, and a dreamer. It is late afternoon. The sun is setting over the city of Seattle, and shadows fall underneath buildings. She will be in her kitchen, stirring lemongrass tea and humming his favorite song. All of a sudden, an abrupt jolt shook the grimy chair and forced Abby awake from all of her musings. She didn't know how long that daydreaming had taken over, but could hear the mutterings of a voice through the airplane speakers, which forced her to take the headphones from her head once more, being nosy as she was. Above her, the fastened seatbelt sign flashed, and out of my window the blanket of clouds got closer and closer still, until they seemed to be passing through them. And everything became a gray shade of misty white, and not the candy floss island that they had been a while ago. The fact that the clouds were now above, rather than below, didn't take a world-class detective to deduce that the plane was descending for landing. It was an unnerving and almost daunting feeling to know that this was it. Once the plane's wheels touched the ground, it would be final and there would be no going back. A small part of Abby wished that this flight would never end, so that she didn't have to deal with the reality of it all. She would even rather have stayed up in the air, with the old bitch sat next to her, than deal with things healthily. The other part of her, she was starting to warm to the idea of what came next. Abby's life in Seattle was well and truly over now. Her life in Ember Falls, Alaska, was about to begin.